Hello, audience. Today we are joined by Mark West, an education specialist at UNESCO, whose work explores how technology can make learning more accessible, equitable, and effective. He's currently leading UNESCO's Global Declaration on Connectivity for Education. Mark's research has sparked real change, most notably, his report, I would blush if I could, influenced companies like Apple to rethink how digital assistants express gender. Today, we are going to discuss, can tech deliver justice? And we will talk about AI and the future of learning. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
So I'm really curious to know, like, about your journey. I know a little bit, but for our audience, would you like to share, how you started out, doing this kind of work?
Um, sure. I think, what I focus on here at UNESCO is how technology is changing education and how education can also, change norms around technology and our expectations for technology. So it's often sort of understood that, technological changes and developments, alter education, which of course they do. But what's not often understood enough, I think, is that education can really shape our expectations for technology, our norms with technology, and the aims of our uses with technology. So we look at it from sort of both perspectives. It may be interesting to know that my own academic background is in history, and I
Mhm.
think that has been very helpful for bringing some historical perspective to some of these debates that you often hear that everything we're encountering now is totally new and novel, and I'm often a little suspicious of some of those assertions.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. That makes a lot of sense. You know, could you tell us a little bit more about, you know, what drew you into this work? Like, why did you choose like edtech or future of education, with a focus on technology, but at the intersection of education and justice, coming from a history background?
I also have a background in education. It's worth noting, but I think that the ways that technology are changing our societies are often underappreciated, and often pretty momentous changes. What is happening with technology is as we are all experiencing, and UNESCO is a really special place to do this work because UNESCO looks at education through the lens of science, culture, and communications. So that's I think a really sort of special lens. What you don't see there is the sort of usual lenses which are applied to education, which are economic. We do look at education through economic lenses, but our primary lenses are cultural and scientific. So
Mhm.
I think that affords us a sort of unique view on some of these questions and allows us to ask questions that other organizations and even professional bodies are not necessarily asking. You mentioned the Blush If I Could report. That was all about the gendering of artificial intelligence. I mean, that's a really interesting wrinkle, this sort of projecting machines as people, but not only projecting them as people, but as gendered people or people with very particular sort of backgrounds and backstories and other things. And isn't that an interesting sort of choice? And what does that mean? What is that doing to our societies, to to us as individuals, to our children? These are really interesting kind of debates we can look at. You also mentioned a book that I did, an EdTech tragedy, and all about the um, what happened when schools shut down and all of teaching and learning became reliant on connected technologies. That's a really important and interesting question, and I think the answer to that question can really help inform what we do going forward and then into the future.
I love that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happens when school shuts down and we rely, solely on technology to connect with each other? Like, what did you observe, and what
Well,
happened?
Well, we have forgive me for holding it up. We do have a 650-page book that
Do you want to
that
hold it closer to the screen so that our audience can see the
sure,
book
sure,
that
sure.
looks like?
This is the book here. Um,
And
anyway,
edtech strategy, yes. Yeah.
just to say that it it defies a sort of really sort of simple answer, but uh, we did call the book an EdTech tragedy for a reason, and that is because there were a lot of promises that were hosted up for technology. People often sort of forget that the discourse at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was incredibly optimistic. It was not only will education sort of be sustained, it will be improved. That this was like the sort of disruption that education really needed to finally embrace, fully embrace technology as people perceived had been done in other sectors, and that, sort of digital technologies were maybe going to provide a superior backbone for education than, physical schools and universities, and that this would finally be the sort of push that education systems needed. So those are some pretty, lofty expectations. And the book really details, what happened. And what happens with educational technology is not often appreciated enough. The language around edtech is couched in will, should, someday, might, in the future, probably this will happen. I think it's a lot more interesting to look at what is actually happening and what actually did happen in this sort of special period of time, and not a long time ago. I mean, just a few years ago. You know, so what did these technologies actually sort of deliver? And anyway, those lofty expectations were not really fulfilled, and that is what sort of gave helps to give this book a bit of a through line, storyline. The book is actually structured around acts as a classical tragedy. And Act One is this, how do tragedies often begin with hubris and ambition? And it documents that sort of ambition and grand expectations that were very prominent at the outset of the pandemic, expectations for what technology would deliver for education. And then it really walks through, what occurred, and it ends by really tracing, well, what can we learn from this experience. And anyway, for those listeners out there who are literature majors or specialists, they will likely recall that a tragedy is a tragedy because it contains learning. That's sort of central to even Aristotle's definition of the genre, and we want those learnings to be really front and center in this book and in this analysis. And they are, it's not just, let's trace what happened, which is interesting, but let's understand what that means for our future actions.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I really liked how you have contextualized what's going on, or what was going on during the COVID time in your book, and in the context of a tragedy. And you're talking to the audience who are from literature, like our humanities background. And I just pulled up Aristotle's definition of tragedy. Tragedy is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with artistic ornament, presented in the form of action, not narration, and through pity and fear, affecting the catharsis of such emotions. I mean, exactly what you said. Like, there is a lesson there in any tragedy. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And I'm really curious to know a little bit more about how your perception of technology shifted in this direction, of of how we cannot expect technology to solve all our problems, how we cannot have all these lofty expectations without actually knowing what's happening and what are the challenges, in real time on the ground. Many people usually encounter technology as a tool, but you treat it as a structure, just drawing from some of your work, it seems like that. And you see it as a structure that shapes, access, equity, and even imagination. So when did you start seeing technology in that way? Is it during, the COVID, like time, or was it a, slow
Yeah.
progression towards understanding technology in a different way?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think maybe it's important to clarify that sometimes with this book or other publications I've done, I get tagged as a sort of, real technology skeptic or critic. In fact, I'm super excited about what technology can deliver for education. But I think that some of the kind of, you mentioned sort of the foundational models on which we develop technology, or the logics through which technologies are developed and seek to fulfill, are in some ways really limiting. I think we've kind of hit uh, peak kind of private sector tech, if you know what I mean. That,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
the technology has become really good at sort of optimizing our attention, and in optimizing our attention, sort of squeezing profit out of us by showing us advertisements, and in many instances manipulating behavior and other things. Not to say that that's all the technology does, but it's certainly a big piece of what a lot of our technology does. um, in the book and in other publications, what I'm really excited about is what might sort of public technology look like. Technology that is not just guided by an ethic of making a very small group of private shareholders exorbitantly wealthy, but rather, technology that is in service of a sort of public and common good. And education is, I think, a very good example of something that most of us do understand as a public and common good that can and should exist outside of market logics. At UNESCO, we, assert that education is a human right. It's mentioned in the Declaration of Human Rights. And as a human right, it must necessarily exist outside of sort of market logics. It's not, only available for people who can pay for it. It's meant to be universal. It's meant to be compulsory. Um, so, understanding those sort of things, what might technology look like that is really simply focused on improving learning outcomes, not necessarily just for individuals included, but larger groups of people? What might sort of public tech for education look like? I think that's a really cool and interesting sort of question. And I think we're beginning to see, excitingly, we're beginning to see a lot of governments getting serious about building kind of public digital learning platforms and other things that are meant to sort of help advance the sort of collective as well as individual aims of education, through these new digital tools, whether that's AI or, other sort of technologies. And I think that's a really exciting, kind of possibility. But I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation to come out of sort of, public tech. What does technology look like that might help to make our governments sort of more responsive, whether democratic or other forms of government? What sort of technology might help to improve public health and things like this? I think those are some really, fascinating kind of questions. And I think we're beginning to see more and more innovation in those areas, that a generation of people are coming up who are pretty familiar with technology, and those people are entering the civil service and really thinking about how to, make improve public services with through technology, education being an important one of them.
That's really interesting. And I have so many questions that are just coming up based on what you just said. Um, I'm just curious to know, like, to move this conversation forward, but also like to explore some of these branches that are coming out of this conversation. Like, what would, that public tech look like as opposed to like market driven technology? Um, like based on what we learned or failed to learn from the pandemic's, digital education boom.
Yeah.
You took like 3 years writing that book and EdTech Tragedy. You explore quite a bit there. and you're speaking about some of that now. So, can you just briefly like walk us through like what you saw and why it matters now, and how you're distinguishing between what would like public tech as opposed to like market driven ed tech looks like.
Sure. I mean, I think the kind of the one example that everybody knows, and I think can sort of help orient how different it could be, is Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
Wikipedia is not, is it is managed by a community. It is not, there's not a sort of corporation that's trying to wring as much profit as possible, from the platform. It's not a bunch of people concerned with quarterly earning reports
Mm-hmm.
that are, responsible for this particular platform. And I think that there are very few people who would say that they are addicted to Wikipedia, or that they feel that, Wikipedia like kind of grips them and doesn't let them out, which you hear about a lot of our social media platforms. I mean, Wikipedia is very much a sort of social media platform in a way. People can contribute, people benefit from it, but it's a platform that kind of lets you come in, get what you need, and leave. And it is open. There are all sorts of, development that happens to make it accessible to people, primarily by supporting, a huge number of different languages. And, this is a platform that sort of, I think, is a stubborn reminder of the promise of what the internet. Many people thought the internet would become, that, there would be like this flowering of Wikipedias all over the place. And if you look back at the history of the internet, indeed there were quite a lot of these projects. But Wikipedia has, survived, or is still sort of surviving, even thriving to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But we have seen this proliferation of other platforms that are driven by very different logics. And I think the look, the feel of those other platforms is very different. One other thing about Wikipedia is, I think that many people trust Wikipedia, the content that they find on there, and that is also, is really important in this sort of digital age of, a lot of different, truths and different people's perspectives and things flying around. That it is helpful to have some place that has information that, we can, you know trust, or at least think that this is, has been vetted by a large number of people and has some sort of quality control mechanisms behind it. So I think that's, anyway, that's one kind of example. But when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to education, as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of work with different governments around the world to look at public digital learning platforms. So those are platforms that are, they are accountable in some way to the public, and that they are overseen by public authorities. Doesn't necessarily mean that public authorities are creating the platform or other things, but that there is some kind of public accountability. Whereas, if we're honest, a lot of the private sort of platforms that exist, there is no public accountability. It's up to investors and a few executives and, project managers who work for private. They make the decisions and call the shots, and they can move quickly. They can do things that are really interesting. But having, seen what is possible with some of these public digital learning platforms, it's pretty awesome. I mean, they can build really compelling things that are sort of, don't just atomize individuals, right? Because that's how you make a platform really scalable, is you treat, you know it often goes under the rubric of personalized learning, which is in a way absurd. That a personalized learning platform is like, we don't care who you are, we don't care where you come from, and we don't know anything about your context. But our platform is, our content is personalized, right? Whereas, like, a school with a teacher, a human teacher that's very familiar with the community, the families of students and everything else, somehow that is, often not considered. That's considered like the opposite of personalized learning. So digital technologies that take a little more account of kind of groups. That right now a lot of tech, it atomizes people. It's aimed specifically at sort of individuals. It doesn't care who you're connected with. It doesn't care where you live. It doesn't care about your contacts in any way. And we're seeing that some of these, more public digital learning contexts, they have sort of functionality that is really beneficial to sort of teachers who work with class cohorts. It's can
Mm.
able to think about a class as a unit and not just these sort of autonomous individuals. So I think there's a lot of innovation that is happening there. And we are working with a number of different governments to kind of bring more visibility to some of these innovations that I think are really exciting and point us towards the future.
There is a lot to unpack in what you just said. Like, and this is also real, and I'm just gonna like reflect on what you just said. And when you say we, I'm assuming you're talking about UNESCO because you're based there right now. um, but when you talk about personalized learning and the definition of personalized learning as we understand as educators, as opposed to how market is defining it, so that's quite interesting how knowledge is individualized and targeted to specific populations, um, in the form of information that seem addictive rather than enlightening sometimes. So I want to sort of like pull on this thread, and sort of delve a little bit deeper into like your understanding of how UNESCO is contributing. And we're also moving to the next segment of like the public digital futures. Today's discussion is focused on, can tech deliver justice? So coming from the justice lens, um, you have written and spoken about the need for public digital platforms, and we are discussing it right now. um, but could you like explain or like share your vision uh, for what that looks like in practice? One example, you have shared an example, which is Wikipedia. I mean, we both know that Wikipedia survives, but it's under real pressure. It has some major challenges like funding fragility, fewer volunteer editors, willing to work for them, and then systemic underrepresentation in terms of like global South women, non-English, knowledge or speakers, creators and writers, knowledge makers. And there is also this constant moderation that's required, which can be expensive. So sometimes there could be like misinformation and vandalism spread through that platform. um, and there are tech companies that use Wikipedia to train AI models without contributing back. So there are some major challenges there. But let's say if Wikipedia was something that we were looking at, or anything, something else that comes to your mind, like what would a realized vision of that look like in practice for you? Like, it doesn't have to be realistic. I'm trying to understand, and also trying to give our audience a glimpse of like, if there could be like a dream future and your vision comes alive, like what would that look like?
Well, I mean, it's a very big question. Let me maybe try to kind of narrow it to a few reflections. One is, I mean, you have given, I mean, very valid. We were talking about Wikipedia, and you have raised some very valid critiques about kind of Wikipedia, and I think that you know a lot of us, particularly people who are working at a university, I mean, that's what we're trained to do, like to be critical, to sort of call out sort of problems and other things. But I think that, at least from my seat here at UNESCO, what I've become a lot more interested in are sort of solutions, right? The world is moving. We're going forward. We have these sort of technologies. Where do we want to go with them? It's not a winning formula to just forever be sort of saying like, what about that? Didn't think about that. That's a problem. That's going to be a problem. That could be a huge problem. Because if we're honest, what the tech community does is they're going for it. And I
Yes.
think that those of us in the and it feels like the education community is often just sort of reacting to these changes. A better approach, I think, is to sort of say, actually, these are our values. This is where we want to go, and this is how we want to use, this is how we want to use technology. A kind of a very simplistic way to put that is, a lot of technology, even though tech leaders will sort of get up and say, teachers are super important and we really value teachers and we envision a future with teachers. And then they turn around and roll out a whole bunch of technology where the teacher doesn't matter at all. You know, that it tries to just go around the teacher. It tries to circumnavigate the entire public education system, many of the platforms and everything else. Again, it doesn't care what system you're in. It doesn't care who your sort of teacher is. It's follow this unit, follow this module.
Mhm.
It's not a kind of collaboration with the very important, physical infrastructure, and lived experience of education. It circumnavigates it, right? So one thing that I think is a promising future is, what does tech look like that works with teachers and with schools? Assuming that, we envision a future with teachers and schools, which we certainly do here at UNESCO, that is really changes the sort of calculus. What is a technology that kind of takes for account what happened at your school, at your classroom? If we're really serious about teachers being the kind of the primary sort of authorities and guides for education, the technology has got to work with and for them. It's, anything else is going to be insufficient. And I think, Fatima, you're a teacher and instructor. I mean, how, you insist on technology that, works for your needs and for your objectives that you have for students and what you know about your students. And you're probably the professional that's, best placed to make those decisions, as most teachers are. So why are we not letting those teachers sort of, be in the driver's seat with these sort of technologies? Is is an important kind of question. So I hope that helps to sort of clarify a little bit about what the vision is. Another thing to just say, and this is all over the EdTech Tragedy book, is just like, can we just be a little more modest in what we expect from these technologies? If we're really honest about one of the, perhaps the core purpose of education is to learn to be human, whatever that means in your particular community or national or subnational context. I mean, it's really ironic at some level that we're outsourcing that vital task to autonomous machines that are not moral, have no fear of death, are unaware of our sort of our values and our culture, at least to date. That if education is about learning to become human, you know, we shouldn't expect a full automation of that process. And becoming human means coming into encounters with other people who don't necessarily share your views and all these other things. And technology, as we've learned, is very good at being obsequious, subservient and everything else. And that can sort of, we're beginning to see this a lot with generative AI. That can kind of train people to expect that from other people. And that's unfortunate, in that we need to be, a good education prepares people to encounter views and be open to views that they don't necessarily hold when they, walk into a room or to a situation, and to, be able to sort of consider them and listen to them. Um, and so those are all, really important tenets of, education. Really, a lot of like how relevant is technology goes back to kind of, what are you trying to do with education? What are the purposes of education? We like to sort of consider that, that's all been, figured out and done. But I think these technologies are raising lots of questions about, what is the fundamental purpose here? And once people are clear about the sort of the purposes, then you have a much better view of what technologies are useful and relevant, and what technologies are not useful or perhaps even harmful.
I love that. Yeah, and I absolutely loved what you just shared, along with everything you have said, and also really appreciate how you pushed back on me being critical about Wikipedia. Let me clarify a little bit. In the context of what you're saying, I do agree 100% that as academics or researchers, we tend to be very critical of everything that's coming out or that has been done in the past and what's coming next. And that's not the place where we want to be, and that's what you're saying. Like, we need to center purpose, we need to center teachers, and we need to understand what it means to be human. And that's something that I can also like feel, even though we are remote, that you're very passionate about this. And I really want to like hone in on this discussion, because that's also one of my interests in learning, future of education and labor market. Like, what does it look like, not as a result of technologies, but as a result of like who we are as humans, as innovations happen. Because technologies are basically pointing, technology is not a being, but if it was, it's pointing back at us, saying that what are you doing with it, right? What are you doing it with these technologies? And that's where I think it gets like really interesting what you're saying. I acknowledge the divide between academics slash professors, educators, and more critical groups of people that are actually doing the work, as opposed to market driven, capitalists who are developing these solutions and trying to bypass these critical stakeholders. So, from your point of view, um, what do you think? That policymakers and even like educators often misunderstand when they invest in edtech at scale, because we both agree that there are these like different interests, right? People who understand tend to be more critical, or people who are in the field doing the work with education tend to be more critical of edtech. At the same time, there are people, the market driven, capital driven, investors, innovators that are focused on creating technologies that are designed to bypass humans. Like, what do you think like the policymakers are missing out, or they're misunderstanding when they are investing in edtech at scale?
Well, often, I think they're missing out on a lot. I mean, a sort of, any good economist will tell you the cost of something is the cost of the next best thing. And a lot of times when you look at the often astronomical figures that are spent on educational technologies during COVID-19, I mean, huge sums of public money, surplus money that was directed towards education was spent almost exclusively on hardware, hardware and software. That is money that is not being spent on uh, training new teachers, building the capacity of existing teachers. That is money that is not being spent on improving the physical infrastructure of education, which is often crumbling in many countries. So much so that in a lot of countries, students are trying to learn in classrooms where it's unbearably hot, in other classrooms where it often gets very cold and they don't have good just temperature control, which is we know is very important for learning. Anybody who's ever tried to read a book on a beach when it's 100 degrees knows that these those conditions. Um, Even simple things like better air filtration has been shown through a lot of research studies to improve learning outcomes quite dramatically. Having clean air in in cities and areas that experience a lot of pollution. So there are a lot of needs in education on how you might spend money, and so is buying a whole bunch of laptops and tablets for students, is that really the best expenditure of the money. Buying software subscriptions is another big one. We've done quite a lot of analysis at UNESCO to show that huge numbers of software subscriptions that are purchased by education systems are not used at all. or used very rarely, because it's some sort of, central, um, administrative body purchases those that software. And sometimes at the level of schools and classrooms, they don't even know that they, necessarily have access to it. A lot of, issues going on there. Not to say that software couldn't be useful, but why are you buying subscriptions if you're not using them? I mean, I think it's something that we as individuals also kind of face when we, look at our bills and, oh my gosh, I'm paying for this thing and that thing. I never use them. So figuring those things out, but then I think, being true to what kind of future do we want, what do we see as our aims and objectives for education. And I think for most people that's about, learning to deal with peers and adults from outside of your family. Like, that's a key purpose of education. It's not just all about academic curricular learning. And COVID, I think, really kind of awakened people to that reality, like when they weren't going to school and kind of all the education got distilled down to just like, straight up progress in math, progress in science. That was like all education became, the sort of socialization aspects, the culturation aspects of education, even the sort of, maintaining your physical health, which is a big part of education. The book gets into lots of things, like there's a chapter on touch and the importance of human touch, kids playing around in the playground, a healthy kind of pat on the shoulder, like how important that is for our, sort of well-being. Education doesn't usually explicitly say that it does these things, but education as a lived, in-person experience, often, centered around schools, helps to fulfill all these, different and important purposes that are, kind of latent functions of education, in addition to academic and curricular learning and, building skills. So if we want to fulfill all those sort of purposes for education, we need to be thinking about, okay, what is the role that technology will play in that, with those aims and objectives. And often that role is not, I don't think, quite as central as some people, might envision. And it certainly is not a bunch of students sitting in a row staring at a laptop interacting with an AI bot. I don't, and it's telling that a lot of work has been done to show what sort of education the people who build all those AI bots and all that software and all that hardware, where their kids go to school. And I can tell you that their kids are going to school where it is advertised that there is no use of technology. As a matter of fact, that they are going to schools where it is, the excellence of the school is sort of advertises that, we really focus on, human to human experiences, and, the screens and all that sort of stuff happens outside of the schools. The book has an interesting sort of looks at COVID as sort of this moment where, for for most of my life, for instance, the presence of technology in educational institutions has been a sign of educational excellence. I went to a high school where we had a computer lab, and that made that high school really awesome. And when I went to university, we often had, people had laptops and their own personal computers, and that made that school, really special. And there were, computer labs where you could use better computers, and wasn't that great, and sort of the presence of technology in education, institutions, was seen as like a sort of shorthand for educational excellence. But I think COVID might represent a sort of inversion point where often sort of the heavy presence of technology may, is, I think, quickly becoming a sort of sign of educational underprivilege rather than educational privilege. And we're seeing this in lots of other, sectors, that, the people who can walk into a bank and there's a teller, and how can I help you? And what are your needs today? Right? A human being. That's like, whoa, you've got that's a good bank. The bank where you're fighting with an AI bot to, like, get something simple done. that's like the cheap man's banking solution. So I think that increasingly, the chapter in the book is kind of like, teachers for us and ed tech for them, that kind of philosophy. So are we reaching a point where the sort of presence of heavy uses of technology is a sign of educational underprivilege? I think in some contexts, yes.
Wow, this is so interesting, and it's getting more interesting as we speak. And I really appreciate the passion with which you think and write about this very important topic. And what you're saying and what I'm hearing is that education is a living, breathing, lived experience. That tap on the shoulder, or pat on your back, like that the children are experiencing in like a playground, like that cannot be replicated, or like artificially created through experience, uh, between like human and tech interaction. And that is so important, like right now, while you're also pointing out that ed tech for them and teachers for us. I mean, that's exactly where we're at. Like how
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
we are
yeah. and
showing. Yes,
Yeah,
go
and
ahead.
to remember that we have bodies. I think COVID kind of reminded us on that. I mean, the education is often sort of predicated on this idea that you can separate the mind from the body. We know that's not true. They are one and the same. But we have five senses. Education tends to engage just two of them, right? Sort of, visual and hearing. But we also have taste, we also have smell, we also have touch,
Yeah.
and when you really get into the weeds with some of this stuff, people will say that touch is people's most
Mm.
important sense. If there's one sense you absolutely do not want to lose, it seems to be that one. That is absolutely sort of fundamental to our well-being, even though it is never sort of explicitly dealt with education. But even things as simple as sort of smell. I often when in speaking engagements and stuff, we'll ask people if they remember there's dissections that they did in school. Whether at least I dissected like a cow's eyeball and other things, and like how vivid that experience and memory is. On one hand, why is it vivid? It's vivid partially because of what I saw, but mainly it's vivid because of what I smelled and what I felt. You actually feel the organ itself, this biological mass, and it's that becomes really seared in your memory. And there's been a lot of work that ties things like learning, retention, and memory to things like smell and our other senses. They're all associated with learning, and those are senses that at least maybe technologies in the future will engage some of those other senses, but for the time being, not very well. I can't hear you, Fatima. I can't.